Hey, Kevin, Francis, and Maddie. I just want to give you an update as to where I'm at in the project that Francis had done for her master's thesis. And Kevin has suggested maybe augmenting that work with some other ideas about the influence of changing temperatures on plant communities, which is right up our alley since Maddie and I and even Jesse Motes have been doing some thermographic imaging of MAT06 as well as elsewhere at Toolik Lake. I'll give you a summary since probably the last thing you want to do is sit through a video of a PowerPoint. I know I would uh, quickly be looking for something else to watch on YouTube. But here's the summary. So I want to return to the original idea that plants will be at greater risk in a warmer future. And that would be because they are getting closer and closer to their critical temperatures. And it could be especially problematic if the variance in temperature increases as well, since there'll be occasional periods where they might actually cross the critical temperature, which could lead to some fatality of the plants. But in the tundra, warming means more nutrients released from the shrinking permafrost, and that nutrient release leads to lower means and variability in plot level temperatures. So species may be further from their critical temperatures, not closer, as you might expect in a different system. However, it is the change in the relative abundance that determines the outcome, and many species will be lost. Now, this might be my inner passion for biodiversity speaking, but there you have it. Okay, so let's start from the beginning. As I understand it, we have two dominant species, Betulinana and Areophrum vaginatum, and they have different critical temperatures, which were measured by Francis. And they both also have different thermal properties, which were measured by Jess Gersony a while back, almost a decade ago. The hypothesis is that if temperatures increase, it puts plants at a greater risk. And those with lower T-crits, simplistically, will be at the greatest risk. Now, you can consider both the greater risk due to an increase in the average temperature or to an increase in the variation in temperature. I think Kevin was particularly interested in the variance, and that is one of the major themes of the LTER. So can we test any of this with MAT06? And just to remind you that my overarching view is actually quite expansive. I've been working on this for some time, getting close to some closure on this project, a few more things to sort of finalize. But just to remind you that what Kevin and Francis have been doing in this project is actually just a subset. So I'd be doing this anyway. It's not really of any extra burden to me. In fact, I enjoy doing it. But I'm going to tell you where my head is at right now, having done the analyses. MAT06 is not a warming experiment. And so I think this sort of idea that we would have a warmer world and somehow the ecophysiological properties of plants would be able to dictate to us some of the ecosystem consequences of that, especially the T-crit that Francis measured. This is not really what's happening. What we did was we added nutrients, and that was our way of mimicking what would happen as the world got warmer. And that led to increases in biomass, which in and of itself is not surprising. You throw fertilizer down almost anywhere in the world and you will see more biomass. I think what makes it interesting when you add fertilizer that you get more biomass, because most ecosystems nitrogen is limiting, is the changes in the relative abundance of species. And what we saw happening at Toolik Lake is actually quite representative of that. So this is a plot of the 2024 relative abundance, the percent cover. And you can see that's our sort of proxy for abundance or biomass, if you will, that some plants really enjoyed the increase in fertilizer, but a lot of them did not. Even one that was fairly dominant declined dramatically, and a lot of the more rare species are either went extinct in some of the plots or certainly on their way. Now, those are very high levels of fertilizer addition, but nevertheless, theoretically, it just shows you that the release of nutrients caused by the warming actually changes the community dramatically. This top line up here is Betula nana, and if we pull the two out that is the focus of this study, you can see that Betula nana has increased dramatically, and Areophorum has decreased almost to the point of being zero in some of the quadrats, which the percent cover was taken. Okay, so how do we justify a study in which we know there are many species and we're only looking at two? Well, the answer I would say is that that Betula and Areophorum, these two species, they both are dominant species. They're up making up a lot of the biomass, and also from Jess's work, they represent the range of plant thermography, plant temperatures. So Betula is one of the coolest of the plants, speaking demographically, and Areophorum is one of the warmest, or among the warm groups. As you see, Jess broke them up into three different functional groups, and they have very distinct differences. That's a pretty interesting study done a long time ago. Now, how do I construct the conceptual framework of what it is that we're doing here? I try to keep it as simple as possible because we don't have a lot of replicates, so we can't test any complicated statistical models. Basically, I'm focused on the fact that fertilizer is added. We had two particular species we were looking at, Betula and Areophorum, and looking at how they relate to the thermal properties of the plots. Now, we know that the sort of extrinsic factors, like whatever temperature was that day, the humidity of that day, and many other factors will affect how thermography actually estimates what the temperature is. So I standardized them all by using z-scores, so that created an average of 0, and then the standard deviation was used to create the spread. And that brought them all in line with one another, and it addresses that so that we don't have to have it in the model. And then, especially since we only did some of these things on one particular day, whereas the thermal properties were collected over 3 days, which is good because we can use the averages. Now, if we look at what actually happened here, there's a lot of relationships because there's a lot of variables. Let's look at a bunch of them. If we look at productivity, which is approximated by NDVI, and look at the temperature of the plots, we can see that the greater the NDVI, or the greener the plot, the cooler the plot is. Again, not terribly surprising. If we look at how much fertilizer is added, we can see that the ratio or the proportion of Betula to Betula and Areophorum, we wind up getting a shift into the dominance of Betula. If we look at the temperature of the plots, we can see that it also shifts as we get to a higher proportion of Betula and a lower proportion of Areophorum. If we look at the temperatures in fertilizer addition, you can see that the temperatures drop as we wind up getting more fertilizer. I think you get the picture that we can look at these as a series of pairwise comparisons. In each case, it's sort of confirming some of our ideas about how things are going. But if you really wanted to test it statistically, you've got to test that model. And we don't have a lot of replicates. In fact, technically there are only 3 replicates. But I took a way of getting around that, and I'm not sure what people will think. I think it's okay. But just to point out again that there are lots of regressions or correlations you can do. This is a correlation graph of the different variables I have in the data that I have, in the spreadsheet that I have. And you can see that we can keep asking questions and using these pairwise comparisons to see if they shed light on them. But that's not really reflecting the fact that they're indirect effects of all of these. The NDVI doesn't change the temperature, but they are correlated. Okay, so how do we deal with the few replicates? What I did was I just converted the treatments to the amount of nitrogen, the 0.5, 1, 2, 5, and 10 grams per meter square. And I treated it as if it was just another variable along with all the other variables. It's fixed effects sort of, and that would change it to a model in which we have to worry about the replication. But this way I wound up getting 6 different replicates per block. So we actually have 18 replicates, and I ignore the block structure too. I don't think that'll change things very much. We can talk more about what we need to do, but here is the structural equation modeling results. Some people, like Jesse Motes, felt that piecewise structural equation modeling, which can test complicated structures rather than pairwise comparisons, was better. And it's actually not that much better, and it has a lot of shortcomings to do it after I looked into it. I hadn't used it before. But I thought I'd better do both, since some people feel that it's actually better for when you have lower replication. But it still requires a minimum of 5 replicates to 10. And we're at 3 unless I play the game that I just did, which I think worked out really well. So here is using the Lavand package in R and using the piecewise structural equation modeling so that we could do a standard structural equation modeling or a piecewise structural equation modeling, which is supposedly a little bit more friendly when you have low replicates, but not that much more friendly. And it also has a lot of drawbacks as an alternative method. But put all that aside, you can see that we now actually statistically test our model. We're not just looking at pairwise relationships, which would, there'd be a number of reasons why that's a bad thing to do. Especially you don't see the indirect effects, but also because if you keep doing a lot of pairwise comparisons, you'd have to change your p-value because you have the possibility of committing a type 2 error. That aside, you can see that fertilizer addition really led to an increase in metrolannana quite a bit, led to a decrease in areophrum, and that metrolannana is the one that's contributing mostly to the cooling that we saw in the plots. The black numbers are the R squares, so you can see they're not bad, especially for an ecologist. The relationships that are significant are all these fat arrows. The one that is very, very thin is not significant. So in fact, we're not really capable to say that that's there. Now, the test actually says that this model is supported by this kind of analysis. So we're good doing that, except whether or not some of the assumptions that we made, some of the interpretations we make, there's always room for stepping on landmines there. But I'm really quite happy with this. I think it actually statistically says what's going on in the tundra, and that it brings it all together. There's a bunch of conclusions. You can go read them. There's more conclusions. But I did want to say, in the end here, that the plot temperatures are going to be a function of the ambient temperature, species composition, which affects albedo, species-specific thermal properties. Are they warm plants? Are they cool plants? Species-specific growth rates. Some become dominant. Some go to extinction. All of this affects biomass. All of this affects evapotranspiration. So I think we have a pretty good idea from MAT06 how the system is changing in ways people haven't looked at before, and that it would be a mistake to simply assume that if we just increase the temperature, that plants would be more at risk. In fact, they might be less at risk. The downside is they might be less at risk, but a lot of the species may have gone extinct or have become rare. And that's not a good thing for BEF reasons, but we won't go into that. All right. Now, I hope this is of interest. Let's get together again when we can find some time. I know the summer is upon us. And if you have suggestions about what more I could do, because I think this is pretty good, let me know. But here's what I'm at. Okay, take care, gang.